Day 151 to 11:55 p.m. Mountain Farming Village, Barangay Mabini, Municipality of Viga, Catanduanes. Mugwort cautiously stared at Mark and May. These two demons appearing here was never a good thing for him. He wanted to flee. As a mist demon, Mugwort had the confidence to be able to escape this deadly situation. He could turn into mist and scatter as if he had never been in this place at all. Well, that was only if the illusory chains on his ankle were never there. Mugwort was careless when he fought Morkel. He thought that it was just an ordinary armor that gained sentience. What he did not know, Morkel was a set of armor worn by a torturer during medieval times. It was an armor bathed with blood, filled with agony and suffering. Because of how Morkel accumulated these emotion-filled energies, it gained this ability. It was a chain that would tie its enemies and slowly drain them of their ability to resist. It was a chain that would not let go of the target unless Morkel wanted to or if the target died. There was also another way to dispel these chains. It was when Morkel's magical energy reserves were emptied. If that happened, Morkel might also die. Cursed items became alive and gained sentience due to accumulated energy, and losing all of it could cause its soul to perish. However, it was the most unlikely thing to happen. After all, Morkel's magical energy was being replenished by the chains. In other words, there was no escaping these chains. Of course, there was no way for Mugwort and the Flame Demon to know all these things. The two struggled to fight the invincible Morkel, not knowing that their fates were already sealed. It might be a long battle since Mugwort and the Flame Demon had a lot of magical energy. The two were high-ranked demons, after all. Nonetheless, they would die soon. Mark and May also did not know that fact. That was why they appeared here to eliminate the possible threat. When Mark declared his and May's arrival, he could not help but turn to Morkel. Although the cursed armor could not talk, he could sense its emotional fluctuations. It actually wanted Mark and May to leave and help the others. It was not hard for Mark to see what was going on. Even though it looked like they were in a stalemate, he could feel the frustration of the mist demon in this battle. And to Morkel's emotion, Mark shook his head. I understand that you can handle this on your own and want us to leave, but we're running out of time. Mark then took out a phone from his ring and showed the screen to Morkel, pointing at the time. They only had 5 minutes left before midnight. Morkel looked at the phone with confusion. It did not understand what Mark was pointing at. After all, there was no way that a cursed armor would learn to read modern human time measurement. In any case, Morkel understood when Mark said that they were already running out of time. Thus, Morkel's empty helmet nodded at Mark. Mugwort, on the other hand, realized that he only needed to stall for time. It was almost midnight. When the clock struck 12, he would gain more power and possibly release himself from the illusory chain. Thus, there was only one thing that Mugwort could do. With a wave of his hand, his figure vanished. Mugwort turned himself into a fog that enveloped the area. The chain was still connected to him, however. It showed the position of the magical energy that was used to materialize his feet. Nonetheless, there was no way for attacks to hit him since his physical body was non-existent. The mist demon thought he was safe in this form, leaving the flame demon to fend for itself. Mark looked around. It was kind of hard to see the surroundings because of the thick fog. Not only that it obscured everyone's vision, but it also applied some sort of illusion. It made Mark remember the time they encountered Mugwort for the first time when they entered Bato. The fog that enveloped them separated the refugees from his group at that time. As it appeared, Mugwort was trying to do the same. However, it seemed that because his magical energy was spent fighting Morkel, it was visibly weaker. Looking around, almost everything was blurry. Mark could not even see too far outside the forest. This situation, however, made Mark smile. Mayor, deal with that flame guy. But don't kill him. Removing his arms and legs will do. Yes. May replied with a nod. Turning her sniper rifle into a sword, her figure flashed towards the struggling flame demon. The flame demon felt the sudden danger and turned away from Morkel. It was when it saw May charging at it with her sword. Panicked, the flame demon conjured dozens of fist-sized balls of flame. Each ball shot towards Mei at fast speeds consecutively. Mei's eyes dilated. In front of her, the scene where dozens of fireballs approaching her slowed down. With a flash of bright light, Mei disappeared before appearing amidst the balls of flames. As the first shots flew past her, the next ones were about to hit her. That was when Mei swung her sword in front, slicing the balls of flame in half. Flash move. Then slash. It repeated several times. The range of Mei's teleport-like ability was short. Thus, she could only do it several times until she reached the enemy. While charging at the flame demon, Mei realized that the fog in the surroundings was getting unsteady and wild. However, she did not pay much attention since it was the flame demon who was her target. Seeing that Mei was still unscathed despite the barrage of flames it was firing, the flame demon became desperate. It conjured more and more balls of flames of different sizes and shot while retreating backward. Unfortunately, its movement could not contend with Mei's speed. It did not take long and Mei was already in front of it. In a last-ditch effort, the flame demon summoned a wall of flames in front of it to stop Mei for a bit. It then turned around to escape. But then, what it saw when it turned around was Mei, halfway through a vertical slash of her sword from above. Grrrrrrrr. The flame demon's gargling voice of pain echoed as its left arm was lopped off. Of course, it did not end there. Mei followed the initial attack with 2 more slashes. Bam! The limbless torso of the flame demon fell to the ground. Instead of blood, oozing flames leaked out of its cut-off stumps. Of course, the flame demon was in a lot of pain. Despite that, it tried to squirm around. Its instinct for survival was kicking in. If it was left like this, it would be able to roll its body away. Well, it would not be able to. The chain that was tied to its bisected limb disappeared before appearing on its neck. There was no way for it to escape. In any case, it would be troublesome if it managed to roll and squirm to a certain distance. As such, Mei took out 2 unused swords from her ring. Without hesitation, she stabbed the 2 shoulders of the flame demon and pinned it to the ground. Mei was done with her work. She then turned to Mark. Mark stood not far from her. He was stepping on something. It was no one else but Mugor. ******* Mark was hiding his cards as much as possible. And among his cards, the thing he was hiding the most was his miasma. After all, not everyone was capable of sensing it and could be used as his trump card. The environment that Mugor created allowed Mark to freely use his miasma without the enemies seeing him. And the worst of the situation, it was one of the things that were the most effective on the mist demon. Mark waved his hands. A thin veil of miasma began to mix with the fog. Suddenly, the fog became chaotic. Mark snickered. Although there was no voice, Mark could feel that Mugor was screaming in pain. Mugor was a mist demon. It was a kind of formless demon and had a body made up of energy. For something with a body like that, miasma was the worst thing they could come in contact with, especially the kind of miasma that Mark controlled. The fog began to disperse. Mugor was losing control of his own body and began to scatter. If he did not gather this body, he would disperse for eternity. Thus, Mugor was forced to recreate his physical body, only to fall under Mark's foot. Unlike before, Mugor's body was incomplete. His arms and legs were not even fully fleshed out. It was the effect of miasma on Mugor. Parts of his body were eaten away in the short time that he was exposed to the miasma that Mark released. How? Mugor voiced out. He was already out of energy to retaliate. The illusory chain of Morkel drained a lot of his magical energy. Mark's miasma was even worse. What Mugor could not understand was how Mark was able to use miasma while being a demon with a flesh body. Looking at Mugor, whose chest was being stepped on, Mark raised his right hand in front of him. The thin veil of miasma in the surroundings swirled, making a surge of black smoke above Mark's palm. Then, the smoke entered Mark's hand and vanished. "Sorry, but not telling," Mark said as he crouched down and grabbed Mugor's head. Mugwort struggled, but it was already futile. Mark concentrated, and the psi crystal on his wrist began to glow brightly. Ah! Mugwort panicked. He struggled in fear. What Mark was doing was far worse than just killing him. Mugger's body was made up of magical energy, and, of course, it was something that the psi crystal could absorb. Continuing to struggle, Mugger's body became more and more transparent. A few seconds later, Mugwort vanished without a trace. The only thing left of Mugwort was a crystal that popped out of the psi crystal. When Mark saw the crystal, he was genuinely delighted. Mark expected some sort of attributed elemental crystal. After all, that was the most common product when Mark was absorbing magical energies from spirits, elementals, and demons. Yet, the crystal from Mugwort was as large as a marble and actually had a misty glowing orb inside it. It was a magical ability crystal. Of course, there was no way that Mark would not be happy at this unexpected harvest. As for the old hag, it only gave him a blackish-red colored crystal. It was even small. That was why Mark did not expect too much. On the side, Morkel looked at Mark with both amazement and fear. Amazed because Mark took care of Mugwort fast and without problems. Nonetheless, it was afraid since it was unable to understand how Mark did it. Well, Mark did his best to hide his miasma, after all. Only Mugwort understood what happened to him. Not paying attention to Morkel, Mark approached May and her prey. As Mark arrived, he gave the finishing blow on the flame demon and absorbed the remnant energy from its body. Unfortunately, all he managed to get was a flame attribute crystal. Well, it was already a good thing since it was a rare item. There were only a few fire element magical creatures that they encountered since the start. Boom! Suddenly, a loud boom echoed. Mark and May could not help but turn their heads towards the direction it came from. Ha 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 ha. That was when they heard the boisterous laugh of Lord Cease. It looks like there are only a few of my people are left. How frustrating. Although Lord Cease said that, he did not appear or sounded frustrated at all. It did not matter. Lord Cease declared, I will make use of their sacrifices. Lord Cease roared. The black sky turned red. The surroundings felt eerie. It was when everyone realized midnight had struck. Day 152 to 12:03 a.m. Katandwanas as midnight struck. Everyone on the whole island witnessed a night they had never seen before. The people in the military settlement in the southwest. The members of the neutral and peaceful factions of the rebels on the north. The exiles of the demons in the east. And even the demons left in their base in the southeast. All of them went out in the open to gaze at the ominous display in the sky. The night should have been dark. It was supposed to be that way, especially on this provincial island. However, the entire island was now being illuminated by a red light coming from the sky. In the sky, the thick dark clouds had begun to turn reddish as they spread out across the island and the bodies of water around it. It was an ominous sight that made most of the people that witnessed it afraid. In the military settlement, the general called for an emergency meeting. Everyone important, even the politicians, were called out due to the unexplained phenomenon. It was not only the people in charge of the military settlement that was on the move. Even the officers and important people among the two remaining factions of the rebels called a meeting of their own. Even the exiles in the east, the people closest to the center of the phenomenon, could not help but think of any possible measures. The only different ones were the demons in Bato. Witnessing the ominous sight in the sky, they all kneeled and prostrated. The humans were in panic. None of them knew what was happening. In the meetings of the different factions of the island, everyone was in a heated discussion. But then, another strange sight came before them as a black-skinned child appeared in each meeting room in the different parts of the island. Of course, due to their agitation to the unknown situation, some of them took threatening measures to the child. Backing away from the child, they aggressively asked who they were. Unfortunately, the children did not open their mouths. It was not like they could not. But even if they spoke, the humans would not understand them. That silence, however, was taken offensively by some. A strange black-skinned child wordlessly standing in one place. especially in a room that they were not supposed to be in. It was a scene often seen in horror movies. Some people took out their guns. The idiots even fired. However, were they unable to do anything? An invisible wall blocked their bullets before falling to the ground. The only place that took the event differently was the neutral faction of the rebels. It was true that some people almost took out their weapons. However, Madame Grace, their fortune teller, told them to stand down. Unable to do something to the strange children, they finally took their time to observe. Of course, cautiously. Then, at the same time, the children took out a crystal ball. No, rather than a crystal ball, it was more like a crystal flower. But then, the children shattered the crystal ball by their feet. Another surprise came as a figure of a beautiful woman appeared from the shattered shards of the crystal. The woman with a flower crown and a white dress stared at everyone in the room. Of course, the people felt wary. Fret not. The woman spoke. We have no ill intentions. Well, the people did not believe her immediately. I am Dewata Araya, the Dewata protecting this island for generations. The woman introduced herself to the people before her. It led to different reactions, of course. Some tried to ask questions, but Araya shook her head. I'm not here to answer all of your specific questions. I'm just here to say that the cause of what was happening on the island was the Lord of the Demons that dwelled in the south. We are amidst fighting him, and I declare that none of you should step into the fray. We know that you humans might send people to investigate the situation, but it better not happen. All you have to focus on are the incoming threat from the bodies of water around the island. That's all I have to say. And there, the figure vanished. Unexpectedly, the children were already gone, and none of the people noticed at all. Some tried to pick and see the shattered remains of the crystals, but the shards soon vanished like magic. The humans were left confused. There were a lot of questions that were left unanswered. However, if what that Dewata said was true, it meant that there were strong forces currently fighting on this island. Nonetheless, everyone was confused. What was the incoming threat that she spoke about? However, it did not take long at all. Alarms rang from all 3 human settlements. Once more, the infected were rising from the sea. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Day 152 to 12:09 a.m. Mountain Farming Village, Barangay Mabini, Municipality of Viga, Catanduanes. Ha! Dewata Araya inhaled deeply as she opened her eyes. Done. A voice came in front of her. It was Mark that was standing before her. It's done. I informed the humans of the incoming threat and not to try and investigate what was happening here. Dewata Araya replied. Good then. It's better if none of them appear here and strengthen that guy even more. Mark said with a frown. Since the phenomenon in the sky covered the whole island, it was very likely for humans to send people to investigate. However, they could not let that happen right now. It was because of Lord Cease. Currently, all the demons on the battlefield were annihilated together with the majority of the forces under Dewata Araya. However, it was neither Mark nor Dewata Araya that was the culprit. All of it was done by Lord Cease himself. No one knew why he killed his own minions at first. The only thing Mark and the others saw was that everyone was swallowed by the torrential storm of energy that Lord Cease released. Now, that storm of energy enveloped the whole battlefield, forcing everyone to retreat outside its vicinity. As for those that were swallowed by the storm, they all turned to unrecognizable pieces of flesh before turning to dust. The storm of energy continued to rage, disabling everyone from coming close. It was not wrong to describe it as a tornado about a kilometer in diameter. The only difference was there was no wind at all. All everyone could see was a dark mist surging around at fast speeds. At the center of the storm, Lord Cease floated still. That was when Mark noticed. Lord Cease was absorbing the energy of everything in the vicinity. He was able to notice it since he had miasma, which had the same ability. The answer became clear. Lord Cease was raising an army not because he needed them to fight. He only needed them as disposable batteries that could give him the magical energy he needed in the future. And now was one of the times that he needed it. It was because aside from Dewata Araya, a few more strong beings were present. This answered the question as to why Lord Cease did not seem too affected by the death of his subordinates. Even at their death, he could take their energies for his own. With Lord Cease absorbing these energies, Mark told Dewata Araya to inform every settlement on the island not to approach this place. It was not a desirable situation if humans came were because of their curiosity and ended up becoming fuel for Lord Cease. Of course, it came with the risk of exposing Dewata Araya's existence. But for Mark that knew that the fusion of dimensions would happen soon, this thing did not matter anymore. Do we really need to do that? Dewata Araya asked Mark. I don't think that humans would be able to reach this place in a short time. Many humans gained various uncanny abilities, Mark replied. Who knows if they had someone capable of reaching this place before we could even finish the fight. At those words, Dewata Araya fell silent. It was true. With the current situation, it would be hard to say that they would be able to finish Lord Cease quickly. In any case, Mark turned to Dewata Araya. You never told me that that guy had this kind of troublesome ability. And to that question, Dewata Araya frowned. I'm sorry, but I had no idea either. The past lords definitely did not have this ability. It might be something that Argrelius awakened on his own. Mark could only shrug. In the first place, this was the first time that Lord Cease and Dewata Araya fought each other. Lord Cease had not been the Lord of Demons on this island for too long. It just had been about 40 years since he became the Lord. At this time, most magical races were already in hiding, and there was no way that they would be able to have a direct clash like this without being found out by humans. All the information that Dewata Araya told Mark was about the past Lords of Demons. After all, being the Lord of Demons was not just a title for the strongest. It was actually being inherited from person to person. In this case, the abilities of the previous lords were being transferred to the next one. Since Dewata Araya did not have any idea about what was happening right now, it was very likely that it was something that Lord Cease learned lately. In any case, it was a rather powerful ability. If Lord Cease continued this and managed to absorb all the energy that created the storm, his abilities would rise further. Probably, he would become even more powerful than Dewata Araya. And, of course, Mark could not let that happen, boss. At this time, Barak arrived, riding on his Thunderbird. Have they retreated? Mark asked. Yes, Barak replied. They were brought away to the sanctuary. Sanctuary. It was what Barak called Dewata Araya's domain. Mark made everyone retreat when Lord Cease began rampaging. It would be bad if any of them got caught with the energy storm. The only ones left here were him, May, Dewata Araya, and unexpectedly, Morkel. Then you should go back. Mark told Barak to return. No, I'm staying. Barak shook his head. I might not be able to help to fight the demon. At least, I can provide support. Remember, I might be a summoner, but I also have other magical skills. Do what you want, Mark said, making Barak smile. The question here is, what are we going to do? Dewata Araya said with a frown. Fighting Lord Cease was one thing. However, they still needed to get past this energy storm. Unfortunately, none of them had the ability to do that. Everything that the energy storm touched turned to minced meat instantly. Although they were stronger beings, the most that they could was last for a few seconds. The only thing we can do is wait. Dewata Araya added. But at that time, it would be questionable if we can still fight him. We might not be able to enter. Mark smiled, but it did not mean that we can't do anything. Mark then turned to May. Look for a good position and prepare to snipe. I'll give the signal. Okay. May nodded and flew away. Dewata Araya then approached him. What are you going to do? Just watch and prepare to fight. Mark said as he flapped his wings. He then flew forward to the storm and landed just in front of it. And there, Mark released his trump card. Dewata Araya and Barak were shocked. Being people that had a strong connection with magical energy, it was impossible for them to not recognize what Mark was doing. At the ground, Mark smiled with both hands stretched forward. Miasma began to envelop the outer perimeter of the storm while the psi crystal on his wrist began to absorb the energy crazily. The storm was made of rampaging energy. What Lord Cease was absorbing was also energy. And to Mark that had two means of absorbing energy. It is a grand buffet. Mark grinned. Day 152 to 12:09 a.m. Mountain Farming Village, Barangay Mabini, Municipality of Viga, Catanduanes. Inside the storm of energy, Lord Cease's large body floated steadily. The spiraling energy was surging towards his body. As it did, his ape-like body was noticeably getting smaller and smaller. Like Dewata Araya thought, this ability was something that Lord Cease gained after he inherited the powers of the previous Lord of Demons on this island. It was an ability that allows Lord Cease to absorb the energy of the dead. Whether it be humans, demons, animals, spirits, or elementals, it did not matter. It was an ability without too many restrictions. Unfortunately, Lord Cease could not do it on a large scale until now. If he could, he would have stepped into deityhood years ago. However, as shown now, doing it on a large scale would evoke noticeable phenomenons in the surroundings. The red sky, the energy storm, and even the strong magical fluctuations, just one of it would attract danger towards Lord Cease. Although a lower deity could kill hundreds to thousands of humans in one move, they were still not impervious to current human weaponry. Besides, the protectors of Earth, the Eyes, would not let it happen. But now, it did not matter. Lord Cease might be able to kill Dewata Araya in a long fight. However, Mark and May were also present. Once the three joined forces to fight him, he would be on the losing side. Thus, before the fight started, he used his strongest card. With his eyes closed, Lord Cease absorbed the torrential energy. This violent energy that came from more than 2,000 demons and 100 spirits and elementals would be more than enough to make him win this fight. Not to mention that there were also hundreds of insects and psionics that Legra created. His whole body felt hot. It was as if Lord Cease was burning and was definitely painful. However, for Lord Cease, it was proof that he was changing. But when Lord Cease felt the energy around him, he frowned. How come that the energy is lower than expected? It was strange. After all, Lord Cease had about 100 high-rank demons that he sacrificed. But the most important were Legra, Mugur, and the Flame Demon. The magical energy from each of those three was more than the energy of the high-rank demons combined. Yet, not only Legra's magical energy was too thin, but he could not feel any shred of energy from Mugur or the Flame Demon. Lord Cease wanted to know what happened. However, he still needed to focus on absorbing the energy he collected. Nonetheless, although Lord Cease was still confident that the energy he gathered was enough to win this fight, it was still concerning that a large portion of the energy that was supposed to be his vanished into nothingness. While he continued to absorb the energy, Lord Cease could not help but smile. He knew that his body was getting smaller the more energy he absorbed. Nonetheless, he was not concerned about his size. Although being a gigantic being had an intimidating appearance, it had a lot of inconvenient points. Being in an efficient body with an intimidating presence was far better. Besides, the body of Lord Cease becoming smaller was proof that his body was being reconstructed. His muscles were being remodeled to contain this large amount of energy. There was nothing for Lord Cease to complain about his size changing. Aside from his size, there were other noticeable changes in his body. The dark brown fur on the body of Lord Cease was turning grayish-white. His ears were becoming pointed. On his forehead, 2 horns started growing. Even the bones on his body began to distort and protrude out of his body. And although it could not be seen right now, his eyes also changed color to a reddish hue. Suddenly, amidst his transformation, Lord Cease sensed something strange. Is it just me, or the energy suddenly got thinner? Of course, Lord Cease was extremely confused. With the amount of energy he gathered, it would take him at least 30 minutes to absorb it in the shortest time. If not, and he needed more time, it would take him about an hour or more in the longest. Because of that, The energy would only get noticeably thinner at the mid-phases of his absorption of this energy storm. Yet, he had just started taking in this energy, and the energy was already thinning out rapidly. Lord Cease stimulated his energy absorption. Sure enough, he absorbed energy faster than before. However, it was far slower than he expected. Finally, Lord Zees could not hold it back anymore. Although it would impact his concentration and speed of absorption, he opened his eyes to look around. That was when he realized. The energy storm he gathered was already surrounded by black misty fog. Lord Cease was startled badly. What in the world? He looked around. That was when he noticed that the black mist was actually slowly eating away the energy storm. That was when he realized. Impossible! Lord Cease roared. How come that there's a thick veil of miasma in this place? The emotions of Lord Cease began to rage. This miasma would definitely mess with his plans. In the first place, how come that a thick veil of miasma appeared out of nowhere? This can't be happening. No, Lord Cease continued to roar as he frantically took in more and more energy into his body. He did not bother to refine it while absorbing. He just gobbled it all into his body. Unfortunately, it was of no use. The thick veil of miasma ate the energy faster than he could absorb. Another minute passed. The spiraling energy could not be called a storm any longer. A breeze would even be an exaggeration. Lord Cease was heavily disgruntled. The transformation that his body had undergone was far incomplete. From the energy that Lord Cease gathered, he only managed to absorb less than half of it. The 7-meter-tall body that Lord Cease had only shrunk to 3 meters. His horns grew too short, and the bony thorns and armor on his body did not fully develop. Nonetheless, the demeanor and pressure that Lord Cease exuded were far different. Unlike before, where he only looked like a scary gigantic monkey, he definitely looked more like a demon lord now. It was a pity, however. Lord Cease failed to reach deityhood because of the lack of energy. Soon, the spiraling energy was entirely consumed. At the center of the veil of miasma, Lord Cease flapped his wings, gritting his teeth to the point that his gums bled. There was no way that Lord Cease could accept this outcome. Finally, he lost his cool. Without any energy to devour, the miasma began to recede. Lord Cease noticed something. The miasma was receding to a single point instead of scattering as it was supposed to be. The red eyes of Lord Cease dilated as he stared at the point where the miasma receded to. You bastard! Lord Cease roared, causing a shockwave that shook the entire mountain. It was unbelievable. It should not be possible for a demon with a physical body to control and absorb miasma. It was a feat that could only be seen from formless and miasmic demons. Yet, a pure-blooded demon with a physical body actually used miasma to snatch the energy he gathered. With the evidence in front of him, there was no way that Lord Cease would be able to deny it. Die! Lord Cease roared as he shot towards Mark below. Boom! A simple punch from Lord Cease the entire 100-meter terrain around him into ruins. There was a 50-meter wide and 2-meter deep crater with Lord Cease at the center. Unfortunately, as if mocking him, his punch did not reach the target like how he did not reach deityhood. Asterisk asterisk. Whoops! Mark voiced out as he turned into black mist in front of the punch from Lord Cease. This guy. I managed to snatch more energy than he could absorb, but he's still on a different level now. From the place, Lord Cease floated and up to where Mark stood. It only took a blink of an eye. It was as if Lord Cease moved instantly. Even his punch was too strong to affect a wide area. Prepare to fight, Mark said as he appeared beside Dewata Araya. There was no time for the Dewata to respond. Lord Cease already looked up and opened his mouth. There, a beam as large as an adult arm shot towards Mark. Like what happened before, Dewata Araya replied to the attack of Lord Cease in kind. She stretched out her hand and shot a beam of her own. However, Dewata Araya's beam was instantly torn apart and the attack of Lord Cease shot towards the Dewata without any resistance. Without warning, Mark grabbed Diwata Araya's shoulder and dragged her out of the way. The two appeared several meters away from where they were before. "Thank you," Diwata Araya said to Mark. She was a bit nervous as she did not expect that her beam was torn like paper. "Thank me later. He's coming," Mark replied as he pushed away Diwata Araya. His eyes glowed from red to violet, watching the incoming figure of Lord Cease. Mark saw that another punch was coming. Thus, he dared try to face it directly. Adrenaline, blood metal armor, blood enhancement. Mark poured everything in his right arm as its veins began to glow brightly. He did not forget his wings, also causing them to glow. Then, Mark shot towards the incoming Lord Cease. Boom! Two fists collided with each other. A powerful shockwave shook the air, forcing Diwata Araya to retreat away. Even Barak, that was already circling on his Thunderbird in the sky, felt the shockwave from 200 meters away. Mark was thrown up to the sky, reaching about 300 meters before he managed to stabilize his flight. On the other hand, Lord Cease barely moved from the point of impact. "Ignorant," Lord Cease mocked. "Although I don't know how you can control miasma to snatch the energy that is supposed to be mine, you are crazy to think that you can contend with my strength." Of course, Lord Cease was delighted. From that collision, the arm of Mark was ruptured, and some of his bones were broken. The Lord of Demons was not staring at Mark's dangling arm, confident that it would be a liability from this time onwards. Diwata Araya turned at Mark. She also thought that he was crazy for clashing with Lord Cease like that. Now, his arm would be unusable. At the sky, although Beret would not dare say that Mark was crazy, he was confused as to why he would do such action and got injured instead. But then, the eyes of all the three widened. "Ignorant? Crazy?" Mark smirked. "I'd rather be called daring instead." Mark then started stretching his newly regenerated arm. It was as good as it was never injured in the first place. "But I admit," Mark's eyes turned serious, "it would be dangerous if I don't go all out." At his words, the air in the surroundings began to shake. Mark began to transform into his demonic form, fangs, horns, and his hair grew. The markings on his wrists and neck began to cover his whole body, including parts of his face. Diwata Araya, Barak, and even Lord Cease were surprised as Mark did not only reveal his miasma and absurd regeneration. Now, he even displayed a demon transformation. It was not unexpected that the three were surprised. Lord Cease transformed after absorbing that torrential energy. On the other hand, Mark could actually do something similar at will. But then, Mark became confused. He could not help but feel the sensation on his back. What the heck? Now, Mark was also surprised. Out of nowhere, another pair of wings sprouted on his back during his transformation. Furthermore, unlike his transformation from before, now, his wings were also covered with black markings like the ones on his body. Day 152 to 12:16 a.m., Mountain Farming Village, Barangay Mabini, Municipality of Viga, Catanduanes. Seriously, what the hell happened? Mark was baffled by this sudden change. Usually, every time his abilities evolved, it would be a painful experience. It was not only once. Mark had experienced it several times already. Yet this time, the only pain he felt was when his arm got broken and during his transformation. Wait. Transformation? Mark had a sudden thought. What if this change only happened in his transformed state? Now that he remembered, he gained a partial state of this transformation after absorbing the deity of bloodshed that tried to take over his body. Then, it fully awakened when he awakened his bloodline and turned into a pureblood blood demon. At both times, Mark did not remember it to be extremely painful, unlike when evolving or gaining new abilities. It was because this transformation was more or less an innate form of his body for being a blood demon. What are you spacing out for? A roar came towards Mark, along with a huge figure charging at him. Watch out! Diwata Araya's voice followed suit along with a blinding flash of light. She shot another beam of magical energy, trying to intercept Lord Cease. FCK off. Lord Cease roared as he shot a beam from his mouth. Like before, the white beam was torn effortlessly by the black beam. Diwata Araya could only retreat hurriedly, unable to hinder Lord Cease in the slightest. Bam! Lord Cease punched Mark, causing the air to shake fiercely. With his outstretched arm, Lord Z's eyes dilated. His punch hit nothing but air. Lord Cease felt a huge threat from Mark and charged with an attack. It was unfortunate because, against Mark, he could not use his energy attacks. It would be a foolish move to use energy attacks on someone capable of controlling miasma. Even so, Lord Cease arrived almost instantly in front of Mark and attacked. He was sure that it would connect. Yet, Mark vanished without him noticing at all. "Who said that I'm spacing out?" A voice came from behind the Lord of Demons. "I just had something in mind. It's not like I'm not paying attention." Lord Cease immediately turned around with his arm lashing at Mark. On the other hand, Mark effortlessly avoided the attack by somersaulting in the air before counter-attacking with a kick. Black flames suddenly covered Mark's right foot and connected with Lord Cease's chest with a loud boom. Crash! The ground below was even more destroyed as the huge body of Lord Cease plummeted down. "Oops! I did a Kuga kick by accident," Mark said with an amazed tone. He opened and closed his hand while staring at it. Mark could feel overflowing energy inside him. Even though he absorbed energy with his miasma before, he never felt anything like this. Boom! An explosion suddenly occurred below, making dust and debris shot everywhere. From that explosion, Lord Cease shot up towards Mark, turning into a blur that was very hard to see. Mark, however, could see the guy clearly. Unfortunately, it seemed that while his kick took Lord Cease out of the air for a bit, he was not hurt at all. The kick he gave only left a slight burn mark on the fur of the Lord of Demons. "Die!" Lord Cease roared once again. This time, it was not just a simple punch. He was exerting pressure with his aura towards Mark. Mark felt stiff. Even in this transformation, the pressure from a being near deityhood was not something he could nonchalantly ignore. Nonetheless, compared to the pressure that the deity of bloodshed, the Great One, and even Chimetras exuded, compared to the eyes, the Lord Cease was nothing. It was one advantage that Mark had after getting in contact with powerful beings. Thus, even if the pressure from Lord Cease had some effect, it would not be able to stop Mark. Blam! Mark opened his wings. The markings on his body began to exude a reddish glow. Suddenly, his wings were covered with black, hazy mist. Lord Cease arrived and attacked. But the only thing that the Lord of Demons hit was a trail of black mist as Mark flew away like fish in the sea. "Seriously, this feels strange," Mark murmured as he glanced at the reddish glow on his body. "But it doesn't feel bad at all." Unfortunately, Mark was aware that while it seemed that his movement and flying speed grew exponentially, he still lacked the physical strength to contend with Lord Cease. Well, it was not like he planned to do so. Mark only did it once to gauge the physical strength that Lord Cease had. And to say, one slight mistake could bring severe injuries to him. No matter how brave and daring Mark was, he would not gamble letting Lord Cease hit his body. It would not be surprising if a single punch from Lord Cease tore a hole in Mark's body. That was the difference in their physical strength. In any case, Mark did not plan on a physical fight. Furthermore, he was not fighting alone. Bang! PSSSK. Ack! Lord Cease grunted in pain. Now, there was a bloody gash on his shoulder. With Mark's signal, May, who was waiting for the opportunity, opened fire. May aimed for the left wing of Lord Cease. To be exact, at the part of the wing that overlapped with his heart. However, it seemed that Lord Cease sensed the attack and tried to evade it. That was why the bullet hit his shoulder instead. Even so, it seemed that the magically enhanced bullets from May's sniper rifle could not even pierce his body. The bloody gash that he received was nothing more than a scratch. Even so, it did not mean that Lord Cease was unaffected. At first, he thought that he should only watch out for Mark and Diwata Araya. Now, there was also May that was hiding somewhere. Lord Cease turned to where the shot came from. Unfortunately, May was already a seasoned sniper. Knowing that her shot did not kill the target, she immediately made her move and left her initial position. Furthermore, with her movement ability, there was no way that her traces would be followed easily. But then, when Lord Cease that it was just 3 people, another attack came. Slash. A gust of wind accompanied by invisible blades blew towards Lord Cease. Like May's shot, the wind blades barely did anything. Nonetheless, Lord Cease could not pinpoint where the attack came from aside from it coming from somewhere below. Of course, it would be hard. Compared to the usual sylphs, a Mihon that started to receive scientific education about wind and air was not someone to ignore. And then, crackle, another attack hit Lord Cease out of nowhere. Up in the sky, Barak commanded his Thunderbird to shoot a lightning bolt towards the enemy. Unlike the attacks from May and Amihon, however, the lightning attack from Barak seemed to have affected Lord Cease more. It was not surprising. In some myths, lightning had a bit of purifying energy that was effective against evil beings. Rahhhh, all of you pests. Of course, Lord Cease was infuriated. The Lord of Demons of this island was actually being toyed with by ants. His thoughts were not wrong. Among everyone here, only Diwata Araya could be considered as the one in the same standing with him. Diwata Araya was a deity. Unfortunately, she was a deity of nature and someone with abilities not oriented for battle. That was why she came short against Lord Cease in terms of fighting prowess. Yet, he was being besieged by the ants he could crush with his raw physical strength. Being the only one exposed, Lord Cease aimed for Barak and his Thunderbird. Flapping his wings, Lord Cease was about to charge towards the target in the sky. "Oi, don't forget that I'm here." A voice entered the ears of Lord Cease from behind. Suddenly, a searing heat hit the back of Lord Cease, causing him to plummet to the ground once more. Bam! Another crater formed on the ground as Lord Cease brutally crashed. This time, Mark was not holding back with his kick any longer. Aside from the flames and the markings on his body glowing red, even his veins all over his body started to glow. But even so, tisk! Mark clicked his tongue. This guy is like a world raid boss. It was a reasonable complaint. The arsenal of abilities of Lord Cease might be lacking. In fact, aside from his voice shockwaves and energy beams, the only magical ability he showed was that energy storm. However, the body of Lord Cease was unbelievably resilient. At this point, it would not be surprising if it needed a nuclear missile to instantly kill this guy. No, Lord Cease might even be able to survive a single nuclear strike. At least 2 would be needed. In any case, Lord Cease was having a hard time fighting multiple enemies at the same time. Crash! Lord Cease stood up from the crater, glaring at Mark. He was still infuriated. However, he knew that this battle was going against his favor. The enemies were like cockroaches. Although he could squish under his foot, they were excellent in scurrying about to avoid him. Thus, although it might be shameful, Lord Cease decided. Boom! Lord Cease punched the ground, causing dust and debris to scatter in a wide area. Then, Lord Cease charged towards the forest. Lord Cease decided to escape. He was not stupid to fight a losing battle. It was not too late to get revenge in the future. At that time, he would be even more powerful. Powerful enough to squish these ants between his fingers. But then, don't think that I'll let you escape. A voice entered his ear from up front. The wind suddenly blew strong, blowing away all the dust that scattered in the air. There, Mark stood on the way of Lord Cease. It was as if he knew that the Lord of Demons would escape. I wanted to conceal some cards since there are pests watching, but it's better showing them than letting you escape. Mark said with a frown. Lord Cease did not try to understand what Mark was saying. Instead, he concentrated on trying to escape. The Lord of Demons charged towards Mark. There was no way that Mark would be able to receive his attack. He would not have any other choice but to dodge. Unexpectedly, Mark did not dodge. With his whole body glowing red, Mark received the punch of Lord Cease with both hands. Crack. Sure enough, Mark's arms got injured. However, he did not get thrown away and managed to take his stand. Bam! At this point, several attacks rained towards Lord Cease that were caught by Mark. Several gunshots echoed. Wind blades flew. A lightning bolt fell from the sky. A light energy beam shot down. RAHHH, of course, even if his body was resilient, he was not numb to pain. Getting hit by enchanted bullets from May. Wind blades. From Amihan. Lightning bolt. From Barak. And an energy beam. From Diwata Araya consecutively would hurt bad. Suddenly, a magic circle appeared under Lord Cease. It started to sap his energy out. Furthermore, a chain shot out of nowhere, tying the other arm of Lord Cease. Lord Cease roared in pain. He tried his best to resist and escape from Mark's grasp. However, Lord Cease noticed several sources of light in front of him. That was when he saw two crystals floating behind Mark, glowing brightly. One was white while the other was green. It gave out the feeling of light and wind energy consecutively. Furthermore, Mark's body also began to release two types of energy. Black flames started to soar out of his body, accompanied by crackling streaks of black lightning. Danger. Lord Cease's instincts were telling that he was in extreme danger. In an attempt to retaliate, Lord Cease opened his mouth, shooting a beam of energy at Mark at point-blank range. However, as Lord Cease expected, an energy attack had no effect on Mark. Like a hungry predator, a veil of miasma swallowed the energy beam that Lord Cease released. The pressure around Mark was suffocating. Even for Lord Cease, it felt harder to breathe. Finally, Mark released 4 attacks at the same time. Boom! A huge explosion swallowed Mark and Lord Cease. The shockwave from the explosion reached several mountains and blew the clouds away. Tons of trees were uprooted, and even Diwata Araya that was floating nearby was swept away by the wind. Veiled with thick dust and debris, the conclusion was yet to be revealed. Day 152 to 12:21 a.m. Mountain Farming Village, Barangay Mabina, Municipality of Viga, Catanduanes. The explosion caused the dark clouds to be swept away from the sky. While the shockwave only reached several mountains, the sound was heard all over the island of Catanduanes. If not for the absence of a mushroom cloud, some people would think that a nuclear explosion happened nearby. Unfortunately, the military settlement in Kodan could not bother about the sound at all. Like the Diwata had warned them, all of the remaining infected under the Gulf began to come ashore. However, there were no highly intelligent leader types left to lead the infected. Although it was dangerous and the soldiers could not let their guards down, it was not too troublesome, unlike the previous instance. In the other coastal areas, infected marine animals also began to come ashore. Fortunately, not many of them were capable of moving on land. Because of this, the supposed infected free island was becoming infested by them once more. At the ground zero of the explosions, dust, smoke, and other debris caused the visibility all over the area lowered to zero. It was not a surprising sight considering the intensity of the explosions. Inside the thick smoke and dust, Mark stood still. Once more, his body was ragged to the bone. Although his blood metal, swift bone armor, and even crimson managed to protect the majority of his body, the impact of the explosion still gave Mark painful internal injuries. Puff! Mark vomited out blood. His injuries were not fatal, but it was still severe. He might need to rest for several minutes to recover from this. Still, Mark stared at what his hands were holding. What a cockroach-like vitality! On his hands, Mark held onto a gigantic severed arm. It was no other than the arm of Lord Cease that Mark held to hold him in place. As for the body, however, it was nowhere to be found. Did Lord Cease die and turn to dust because of the explosion? Mark sighed. Unfortunately, no, master. A tiny cry was heard, coming closer to Mark's position. He then sensed that it was not only Amihan. Even May was coming. Ha! Mark sighed as he threw away the arm he was still holding. He sat down on the ground with his aching body. At this moment, Crimson detached himself from Mark and appeared on his shoulder. The little guy was also worried about Mark. "Ah, right. You two, return inside," Mark said, glancing at the two dimmed crystals unsteadily floating above his shoulders. Both the photokinesis mental crystal and wind manipulation mental crystal had their energies used up entirely. The two would be unusable for a day or two from now. Swoosh. Suddenly, the dust and smoke were all blown away from Mark's vicinity. Without a doubt, it was Amahan's work. "Master." Amihan charged at Mark, extremely worried. She hugged Mark's head, crying. Gurgur. May also arrived with a distraught look as she stared at Mark's current state. Without minding the dust on Mark's body, she gave him a tight embrace. "You too, I'm fine." Mark coughed. "Don't hug too tight, it hurts." "Also, you too. Before closing in the area, make sure that the enemy is already defeated. What you two did is dangerous," Mark added, reprimanding the two. Both May and Amihan nodded, but they did not take it to heart right now as they were more worried about Mark. Did he escape? Those were the words that came out of Diwata Araya's mouth as she landed. Her eyes were fixated on the two severed arms on the ground. One was the arm that Mark threw, while the other was still chained to Morkel that was already running towards the group. Barak landed with his Thunderbird, looked at Mark with a troubled look while assessing the destruction that Mark caused. Well, the whole place was leveled. What they were standing now was a crater about half a kilometer wide and 5 meters deep. The farming area of the village was all gone. Even the flowing river nearby was blocked by the debris and began to overflow on the abandoned rice fields. "Well, that guy is pretty decisive," Mark replied to Diwata Araya, also looking at the arms on the ground. "But it's not like I'll let him escape just like that," Mark added with a satisfied smile. ******* In a forest more than 1.5 kilometers away, Lord Cease was running as fast as he could. In the last moment, Lord Cease severed his two arms to escape Mark's grasp and Morkel's chains. He used his own energy beam to sever his arms. Because of this, the Lord of Demons managed to escape the direct hit of Mark's attack. But even so, Lord Cease did not manage to avoid the attack entirely. Since it was already at the last moment that he decided to sever his arms, it was already late to entirely avoid the attack from Mark. Thus, even though he did not die, Lord Cease was fatally injured. The wings of Lord Cease were both gone. It left only the root of his wings on his heavily burnt back. Of course, both his arms were missing. The bones on his right leg were cracked. Lastly, there was a bloody hole and a chunk of flesh missing from the left side of his stomach. "Damn it. Ack!" Lord Cease cursed as he violently coughed out a mouthful of blood. Even his organs were severely injured, and his lungs were starting to get clogged with blood. However, Lord Cease did not stop running even with his current condition. In his current state, even Diwata Araya would be able to kill him. He needed to run as far as he could before he could feel safe. Lord Cease continued to run for minutes and managed to cross several mountains. He was not far from the vicinity of Bado. Just another mountain or two, and he would reach a place where he could slowly heal his injuries using the demonic energy that enveloped his territory. Still, for some reason, Lord Cease could sense danger. It made him think that the battle left a trauma in his mind, making him paranoid. Crack. The bones on his right leg finally gave way, causing Lord Cease to tumble down the mountain. Ack. The sudden accident made Lord Cease spit out another mouthful of blood. Lord Cease looked at his right leg. With its bones broken, it was twisted in a horrible way. Even so, even with just his remaining left leg, Lord Cease continued to escape. Of course, it caused him to fall now and then. This body was not in shape for him to jump around in one leg. Finally, his body could not hold out any longer. After he fell down, Lord Cease could only drag his body under a nearby to sit down. He needed to rest a bit and continue to escape. Lord Cease was already far from where the fight happened. This place should already be safe. But then, swoosh, a sound of wind being torn apart entered his ears. Being tired and injured, Lord Cease was late to react. PSSH. Lord Cease's eyes turned wide. A strange-shaped blade was embedded on his chest from his back, and then... bam! Cack! Blood sprayed from the mouth of the Lord of Demons. The sword burst into black flames, frying his organs and heart. Damn it! Lord Cease cursed in his mind. He had no energy to let out a voice anymore. Then, he let out a smile. My wife, my child. I regret not being able to avenge you too, but I'm coming now. Argrelius. It was the name that Lord Cease had until about 40 years ago. It was at the time that Lord Cease was still not a demon. He was not an elemental or a spirit. He was just a humble cave giant called Manangala. Manangalas were creatures known as hairy humanoid giants. Their bodies were covered in black fur, they had deep voices, and their faces were vicious looking. In modern times, their kind fell into the category of cryptids, like the well-known Bigfoot. Despite their scary appearance, however, these gigantic creatures were shy and harmless. They only hunt animals, fish, and shrimps for consumption and never humans. The life of Agrelius was just as described as he lived with his family of 3. He was together with his wife and child, living in Mount Isarog. It was quite far away from the island of Katandwanas, if one was to say. Mount Isarog was located in Camarines Sur, after all. It all changed in the 1980s. Argrelius left their humble abode to hunt for food on that tragic day, only to come back to their cave to see it filled with human soldiers. Hiding in the dark, he waited for the humans to leave. That was when Argrelius realized. His wife and child were nowhere to be found. They were caught by the humans, and the soldiers were scouring the mountains for him. After all, if there were a mother and child present, there should be a father. As a creature with low intelligence and afraid of humans, the only thing that Argrelius had in mind was to flee. And to say, his escape was not a smooth one. The soldiers found him and chased him to the point that he had no choice but to flee the mainland, swimming across the Langanoi Gulf. That was when he found himself on the island of Katandwanas, the island where a Dewata was still known to reside. Argrelius tried to seek the Dewata and ask for help. He wanted to rescue his family from the hands of vile humans. He did manage to meet her. However, Dewata Araya was not convinced to do what he wanted. A deity that was supposed to help the creatures of nature actually declined to help a poor creature like him. The reason? Because it would cause a conflict against the humans? Compared to 2 cryptids, the lives of more creatures weighed heavier. Distraught, Argrelius wandered the island. He was angry at the humans. He was also furious towards the Dewata that abandoned him and his family. That was when he met a powerful being, the previous Lord of Demons on this island. Due to an injury caused by a conflict between the demons and Dewata Araya's side a long time ago, the Lord of Demons was weakened and was only waiting for a suitable successor. Argrelius was the one he was waiting for. A creature filled with hatred and malice towards humans and the Dewata that had forsaken him. Inheriting the powers of the previous Lord of Demons, Argrelius became Lord Cease. The first thing he did was to try and rescue his family. He ended up killing the soldiers that invaded his previous home. After torturing some of the soldiers, a piece of awful news reached him. His wife and child died after being experimented on by humans. In a fit rage, he slaughtered humans in the mountain, whether it be soldiers or not. However, that caused a large-scale assault of humans to be sent to dispose of him. As Lord Cease had only received that ability at that time, he was still weak. Thus, he was forced to flee back to this island and slowly build up the powers to dispose of the humans. So, that's his story? Mark asked Dewata Araya while looking at the dead body of Lord Cease that Ignis painstakingly transported back. Unfortunately, yes. Dewata Araya nodded with a regretful look. I want to help him at that time, but... You can't risk more lives only for the sake of two people. Mark said, making the Dewata nod. It was a pitiful story. Mark knew a part of this story. There had been a rumor circulating during the 1980s where the soldiers caught two Manangalas in Mount Isarog. Of course, the details were vague, and no records were known even on the internet. It was very likely that the government erased and covered up the events that happened at that time. In any case, the revenge that Lord Cease longed for remained unfulfilled. It was unfortunate. If only Lord Cease did not stand on the opposite side of Mark's camp. Day 152 to 12:25 a.m. Mountain Farming Village, Barangay Mabini, Municipality of Viga, Catanduanes. The Lord of Demons in Catanduanes was killed. The only thing left was to clean the remaining filth on this island. However, Mark was not in the mood or state to do all that immediately. Amidst the destroyed battlefield, Mark sat with his back on ruined debris. His energy was drained, and his body had yet to fully heal. It seemed that his injuries were too heavy for his absurd regeneration rate to take quite a lot of time to heal him. And to say, it was not wrong. If anyone else was in Mark's current state, they would have died at the moment they received such injuries. The fortunate thing was that Mark's main ability as a mutator was his blood. Even with his severe injuries, he would not get heavy internal bleeding and would still circulate his blood as much as he could. He would not suffer from unintended blood loss either. What Mark did was another suicidal move. Even so, there was no other choice if they wanted to end the fight quickly and stop Lord Cease from escaping unscathed. Well, Lord Cease still managed to escape. However, he was in the state where a single stab from Ignis managed to take his life. Mark's self-inflicted injuries were not for naught. Nonetheless, May and Amihan surely hated to see Mark in this state. It could not be helped, though. It was the only way. Besides, Mark succeeded in killing the greatest threat. At the side, Dewata Araya, Barak, and Morlkal were standing guard. At Mark's current state, it was better not to move him around too much. They already saw his absurd healing ability and knew that they only needed to wait for a bit longer. This guy is not turning to dust, huh? Mark said, turning his head to the body of Lord Cease lying on the ground. It likely would not. Dewata Araya shook her head. He became a demon with a refined body. Besides, before he was a demon, he is a Manangala. He is not a creature that had a body made of magical energy. That was true. After hearing the story from Dewata Araya, it was not surprising that Lord Cease's body would not turn to dust, unlike others. Sadly, though, it was very likely that his wife and child's bodies were used for more experimentation after their deaths. It was not even surprising if their skins were preserved and stuffed with things to display somewhere. What are we going to do with this body, though? Bury it? Mark asked. Wait. Barak interjected. This might be disrespectful to the dead, but we should at least get his blood. The blood of near deityhood demon will be a lot useful in many things. Don't think that it's disrespectful. Mark turned to Barak. His story might be pitiful, but he's still an enemy. Even if he chopped him to pieces and feed his guts to animals, no one will question us because of the things he did. Mark's words made Dewata Araya nod slightly. Compared to everyone here, she was the one who knew most of the things that happened on this island. And to say, what Mark said was already light considering the sins that Lord Cease committed. Forcing humans to turn into demons. Making countless children into feral demons and spreading them throughout the island. Using human females as breeders for their demonic creatures. There was a lot more. But even so, humans were the ones that started everything. That was a fact that no one would be able to deny. And to say, Dewata Araya had a part in it too, since she was one of the reasons Lord Cease, no, Argrelius, embraced the inheritance of the previous Lord of Demons. While Mark was talking about the body, May and Amihan were a bit confused. Normally, before talking about disposing of the body, Mark would, without a word, try to see if he could get something out of the body using the psi crystal, yet, he had not done so. It was strange. The two were about to ask Mark about it when they saw Mark having his index finger in front of his lips while looking at them. Mark was telling them not to ask anything, at least, not for now. Then, take his blood, Mark told Barak and then asked, would his body have no other uses? We better dispose of it, really, Barak answered while scratching his head. If possible, we should burn it to ashes than burying it. Mark tilted his head in askance. Just burying it might give access to insects and animals to eat his remains, Barak explained. A body of a demon in his stage will likely turn animals into feral and demonic ones. It can also cause a poisonous miasma to scatter in the surroundings while his body rotted. And to say, his body will not rot for decades. That's more than enough to turn half of this island into a land of death. Magical methods of disposing of a body as this exists. Some Chinese guys can use this body to make some kind of pills. There are also burial methods that used sealing magic. And you knew none of those. Mark stated the fact, and Barak could only nod. You can all leave the burial to me. Dewata Araya spoke. I can purify his remains and put guards into the burial site. It will prevent poisonous miasma from appearing and avoid animals from eating his body. Barak turned to the Dewata, scratching his head. How could he forget that they had someone with pure nature-inclined magical energy? Then, we'll leave it to you once we're done with his body, Mark said to Dewata Araya before turning to Barak. You should start draining his blood already. Yes. Barak replied with an excited look. He never had the opportunity to get valuable material like this for his entire life. There was no way that he would not be happy. As Mark already gave permission, Barak then bit his hand, letting it bleed. He then drew some magical patterns on the body of Lord Cease. Everyone watched him with askance. Barak was only supposed to get blood from the dead body. What was he doing? Sensing everyone's gaze, Barak explained further. It's some magic that will drain blood from the body without waiting for a long time. Usually, I use this to drain blood from animals when I'm staying on a mountain. It was not surprising. Barak was a summoner that needed to contract magical animals. He would spend a lot of time in the mountains, and he had to provide himself food for sustenance. The meat of animals not drained of their blood had a bad stench and was not too tasty to eat. As Barak explained, he began to chant, and then, the magic circle he drew began to glow. Like what Barak explained, blood began to seep out of the pores on the dead body. It began to float above the magic circle. However, while concentrating, it seemed that Barak was being drained of his energy too. **T. Draining blood from this guy is too hard. I will have to do this several times. As it appeared, Barak was having a hard time. It was a body of a near deityhood demon, after all. Not just some animal he hunted in the mountains. The difference between the strength of Barak and Lord Cease made it hard for the Barak to do his job. While Barak was doing his intended work, Mark suddenly glanced to the side of his eyes. He did not move his head, but it appeared that he was paying attention to the direction behind him. Finally, Mark showed a relaxed expression. Darn, they finally left, Mark said. Aren't they satisfied with me using miasma? It looks like they wanted to know more. They should mind their own business. No, I guess this is business to them. Gurgur? May tilted her head. There is someone watching? May then looked around. Her eyes dilated. She was definitely zooming in her sight in the general direction that Mark paid attention to. Don't look anymore. They already left. Mark patted her head. Enemies? Emihan asked. Not entirely. Mark shrugged. Right now, trading partners, I think. Everyone was confused about what Mark was talking about. However, it was clear that someone was watching during all this time. Mark took a deep breath. For now, there was no threat left to pay attention to. It would have been fine if it was Valflora that was watching in the shadows. However, although Mark recognized the presence of that guy watching them, he never saw him in person. It would be hard to gauge his intentions for watching the battle. However, it would be bad if Mark made a move on that guy. After all, it was one of Valflora's companions on this island. Without the threat, Mark finally did his work. Barak took out a glass bottle from his backpack. He then let the floating blood of Lord Cease enter the bottle, filling a third of it. Barak then took a break. He was drained of his magical energy. After Barak went out of the way, Mark began to use the Psi crystal on the guy. Everyone watched the spectacle of the energy of Lord Cease being sucked into Mark's wrist. Unexpectedly, everyone felt a heavy pressure when Mark began. Sure enough, Lord Cease was not entirely dead. It was only his body that died, but the inheritance of the Lord of Demons prevented him from passing on entirely. Although it was in a state of dormant sleep, his soul was still trapped inside his body. Tisk. Mark clicked his tongue. It's good that I did this. If we just let his body get buried like this, he might get up again in the future. It might be where the stories of Lords of Demons being sealed after their death came about. It was because it was not an actual death, and they might rise again in the future if they were only buried normally. And in this state, burning the body was out of the question. It might end up turning Lord Cease into a demonic ghost in the future, waiting for another creature to receive the inheritance of the Lord of Demons. However, it was the end of this chain. It was because of the existence of the Psi crystal. The magical energy was being drained by Mark, causing a small storm. Sure enough, the energy from a near deityhood being was immense. Crackle. As Mark squeezed out the last bit of energy from the body, the Psi crystal let out an electrifying sound. A crystal was formed, floating in front of Mark. It was a clear-colored crystal. However, the orb inside it was pitch black, causing the crystal to reflect the same color. Furthermore, it had an ominous aura around it. It was an ability reflecting the strength of Lord Cease and his previous predecessors. In any case, this ability was now Mark's. With a smile, Mark grabbed the crystal. Unexpectedly, it struggled in Mark's grasp. It was not the first time that a crystal behaved like it had a will of its own. The first was when Mark took the ability to call storms. The second was when he took the ability of the oracle. This was the third time. The crystal was struggling violently. Mark, who was still injured, was having a hard time not letting it go. Thus, Mark tried to subdue it by force. Miasma covered the hand that was grasping the crystal. Unexpectedly, it reacted. It stopped behaving violently. Instead, it shivered fiercely inside Mark's palm. The crystal was afraid of miasma. Don't struggle anymore if you don't want to vanish from existence. Mark threatened. Unexpectedly, the crystal stopped resisting as if it understood Mark's threat. Before it actually tried to escape once more, Mark stored it inside the Psi crystal. As Mark did, the ties between the crystal and Lord Cease were severed. From the dead body of Lord Cease, a greenish orb of light floated before vanishing. The soul of Lord Cease was freed, enabling him to reunite with his family in the afterlife. Was it a good ending? Not exactly. Crack. Suddenly, the sound of glass cracking was heard from above. Everyone was alarmed and looked up. **T. Mark could not help but curse. It might have been a bit late. However, it seemed that the battle here caused the dimension barrier to collapse a bit. They could see holes in the sky. But then, a familiar childish voice echoed. What the heck is happening here? It's not time for this yet. An 8-year-old looking girl bellowed in the sky. Her 3 vertical eyes were not something that Mark, May, and Emihan would forget. But then, they noticed that she was not alone. Beside her was a familiar old man, wearing old Filipino traditional clothes. Sure enough, the 3 were surprised. Why in the world was Bathala together with Fourth, the embodiment of amusement? Day 152 to 12:30 a.m. Ruined mountain farming village, Barangay Mabina, Municipality of Viga, Catanduanes. The arrival of the 2 people, Bathala and Fourth, was very surprising. It was even more for Mark, May, and Emihan. After all, they knew that the 2 were not supposed to be together. Hey, what happened here? Fourth's eyes fell on the group below. Bam! The surroundings felt heavy. Barak and Morkel fell on their knees immediately. Although Diwata Araya did not go down like the first two, she was having a hard time just standing up. However, despite the situation, her attention was more focused on the old man than the source of the coercing pressure around them. As for the last three, Mark, May, and Amihan, Mark took quick action fast. When he felt that Fourth was agitated, he immediately put his glowing hands on their heads to protect them from the pressure. Mark then raised an eyebrow as he stared at Fourth. Who do you think can answer your question if you don't control that strong pressure from you? That was right. It was one mistake that would happen to a lot of beings in power. Asking questions while releasing out heavy pressure or killing intent. Then, getting angry because no one was able to answer. It was plain stupid. The idiots were not the ones unable to answer but the ones asking the question. In any case, it was different in this circumstance. Who else? You, of course. Fourth proudly replied to Mark with her hands on her waist. Mark could not give a comeback here. Fourth knew that Mark could withstand the pressure from the eyes in the first place. In any case, calm down and retract your aura. Mark shrugged. I'm not in the state to talk a lot right now. Ask her instead. Mark then pointed at Diwata Araya. Beside Fourth, Bathala stared at the two while sweating bullets. He was afraid that Fourth would get angry because of how Mark, a lower creature, behaved in front of her. Unfortunately, he was not really in the position to meddle here. It was kind of amusing to see an actual god to be afraid of a little girl. Unexpectedly, Bathala saw Fourth withdraw her pressure and actually floated down in front of Mark. You got injured? Fourth asked, looking at Mark's state. Isn't it obvious? Mark said, pulling at his clothes. Torn clothes are not an injury. Fourth retorted, but I'm not gonna argue. Your voice sounds rougher than before. I'm pretty sure that you're suppressing the pain right now. But then, Mark glanced at the sky. Before asking questions, shouldn't you better deal with that first? Ah. Fourth looked at what Mark was glancing at and exclaimed in panic. Without waiting for her to forget once more, the little girl rushed towards the sky. As the little girl flew, Mark stared with interest. It seemed that he was right. The eyes could mend this kind of trouble. In fact, Fourth began to close the holes in the sky. Of course, despite the distance, Mark could hear her annoying grumbles about making temporary repairs. At this time, it was Bathala's turn to go down to Mark's group. And then, it was Diwata Araya's turn to go down. She was not just kneeling. The Diwata was actually prostrating. Mahabhajing Bathala. Diwata Araya respectfully greeted. Being greeted like that, Bathala let out a bitter smile as he helped Diwata Araya up. You don't have to do that, my child. I am nothing but a forgotten god now. I cannot do that. Diwata Araya replied. Forgotten or not, you, Bathala, is our creator. Likewise, even if the majority of humans in this country had forgotten him, his creations would not. Although the Dewatas were not the direct creation of Bathala, he had some hand in their existence. In the first place, it was odd that the descriptions of nature deities, the Dewatas, were more or less endemic to the country of the Philippines. It was Bathala's influence in this country that caused the birth of Dewatas in the past and in the present. To Diwata Araya's respect, Bathala smiled. Then, he turned to Mark. I'm surprised. When I met you before, you don't even know anything about the eyes. Now, you actually have a good relationship with one. Mark could only shrug slightly. We're not close, she just finds my existence amusing. You're mistaken. Bathala shook his head. Do not think that the eyes would just follow the words of anyone. She even showed concern for your injuries. Mark did not reply. In the first place, even as an empath, it was kind of hard for him to exactly pinpoint the emotions of the eyes. Instead, Mark asked back a question to Bathala. How about you? Did you get caught? At Mark's question, Bathala smiled. You can say that. Though I don't really have any choice but to turn myself in. Bathala then turned to the holes in the sky. As you can see, the walls are weakening. Just my existence in the spirit dimension is causing it to collapse. That's why I can only enter the mortal world where it is stable. Of course, The eyes immediately found a foreign god like me. "You're not going to get killed, right?" Mark asked. It was all right for him to show concern about this. Bathala not only gave them gifts last time but also blessed his relationship with May. "No, fortunately." Bathala shook his head. "I already learned the truth. I might get erased if it was the past, though. I was just lucky this time." By the looks of it, Bathala had no choice but to leave the spirit dimension. It was in fear of it collapsing because of this existence. He was putting himself at risk for his people. It was his known character since the past. However, it seemed that the circumstances changed now. "We need them to contribute their energy. Then, we'll send them out to the upper realms where they should go." At this point, Fourth, that was already done with her work, just went down and chimed in. "Them, huh?" Mark noticed. "So, there are also others." "That's right." Fourth nodded. They had no choice but to come out of hiding because of the dimensional instability. If they did not and the space in the spirit dimension suddenly collapsed around them, they might lose their lives even if they call themselves gods. From there, a round of information exchange happened. At first, Dewata Araya looked at Fourth with a bit of a condescending expression. It could not be helped as she did not know who Fourth, who looked like a strange little girl, was. Furthermore, she showed no respect at Bathala, who was worshipped by the Dewata. Fortunately, Bathala there to manage the Dewata. As Mark suggested, Dewata Araya did the explaining, pointing at the dead body of Lord Cease. She told that the dimension holes that appeared were all the fault of the Lord of Demons. Well, although it sounded like pushing the blame on the dead, it was the truth. Realizing that Mark's group was just preventing the worse, Fourth's mood lightened. It was true that it could have gotten worse if Lord Cease was not defeated. While the exchange was happening, Bathala took the opportunity to greet Amihan and May. The amicable god sure was fond of interacting with people. To the side, Barak watched the scene in utter silence. It was not like he did not want to join in. It was more like he should not. After all, in front of him was the actual god of creation in Philippine mythology. Furthermore, even though he did not know what Fourth was, for a god to be afraid of her, she would be someone higher. And that pressure from earlier, it made Barak quite afraid of this little girl. That was why he decided to stay silent beside Morkel. In any case, Barak's view of Mark's group changed drastically. It was even more to Mark, who could casually converse with these godly figures. As for Mark, he intently listened to Fourth and Bathala. As it appeared, they were in the middle of a conversation when Fourth noticed that there were issues with the dimension barrier in this area. That was why the two were together. "By the way," Mark spoke. "Why do you guys need the energy of the gods? It's not to repair the dimension wall, right? If that can happen, we'll do that." Fourth sighed. It seemed that the situation was not amusing for her. "It's good that you are here. I'm looking for you, actually." Mark was confused. But then, he realized the only reason that an eye would be looking for him. Then, Fourth pointed upwards to the dark sky. Mark could only follow the direction pointed by her finger, looking at the sky intently rather than just a glance. The others did the same, but it seemed that only Bathala understood what Fourth was pointing at. As for Mark, his eyebrows could only make a frown. He saw what Fourth was pointing at immediately. Mark had full access to his subconscious memories. Even just a glance would make him remember things as long as the details were seen clearly, and from what he had seen in the past nights. Something had changed. Mark was sure that at the direction where Fourth was pointing, there was no star. But now, there was something twinkling there. "That's not a star, is it?" Mark spoke. "And for sure, not a meteorite either. I'm pretty sure they don't twinkle like that." "That's right." Fourth replied. "It's not a star or a meteorite. Absolutely not a comet either. It's a huge chunk of metal. That's why it's twinkling." "Metal?" Mark was confused. Well, it was not only Mark. Everyone here was. Did it come from some sort of mothership? Fourth knew their confusion. Thus, she began to explain. "That's a huge chunk from an artificial planet that exploded. As for the reason why it exploded, I guess I don't have to explain it to you, right? Fourth said, staring at Mark. And, of course, Mark could only frown. There was only one planet that he knew why it exploded, and it was likely what Fourth was implying to. The planet got infected. Mark murmured. That's right. Fourth nodded. It came from an artificial planet that got destroyed after an outbreak struck the inhabitants. And then, Fourth showed a serious expression. It will be the cause of the second wave. Well, damn it. Mark's shoulders fell. Are you telling me that another variant of this outbreak will come from that chunk? Fourth did not reply. It was a sign of agreement. Mark's head started to ache. As it is a foreign matter, we barely had any information about that planet or this chunk of metal approaching Earth. Fourth explained further. All I can say is we only have another week before that thing hit Earth, probably less. So, you are going to use the energies of the gods to stop that thing? Mark asked. Unfortunately, that won't be enough. Fourth shook her head. The gods of the past already lost most of their powers. The most that we can do is to prevent it from directly destroying Earth after it hit. While we use the energy from the gods to do that, SIs will prevent any large catastrophe from happening inside our territories. And then, Fourth dropped a bomb. It's unfortunate, but South America might probably sink. It was surprising. Fourth said that the eyes would protect their territories. Then, why would she say that South America would likely sink? Mark, May, and Emihan fell silent. They knew the reason. South America lost its protector after one of the eyes vanished. It was very likely that the eye that Mark fought before was the protector of that place. However, that eye was turned into a puppet by the Great One. And then, Mark disposed of the puppet. Who would have thought that it would cause a whole continent to get destroyed in the second wave? In any case, it was not Mark's problem. Right now, what was on his mind was to hurry up with their plans. It was good that his business here on this island was almost finished already. Then, they could leave to get Edzel's mother from the grasp of the Tamawas. Day 152 to 124 a.m. Sanctuary, Katandwanas Mountains, Municipality of Bagamonok, Katandwanas. The aftermath of the battle in the mountains was not a good place for people to talk. There was nothing else left there but ruins of the village and the forest that surrounded the area. After Mark recovered enough to be able to walk, he suggested changing the place for the conversation. Of course, the only place suitable for them to talk was the sanctuary managed by Dewata Araya. There were no other places on this island that would do. The way back to this place was rather silent. The Yasas that helped everyone traverse the long distance in a short time were shivering at the presence of Fourth. The other spirits that managed to survive and remained near the area did not want to travel with Mark's group at all. It was also because of her. Fourth had already controlled the godly pressure around her. Even so, the spirits and elementals around were still afraid of her. Unlike humans, spirits and elementals were far more sensitive to the presence of Fourth. Unfortunately for Bathala, Fourth completely overwhelmed his supposed godly presence. In the first place, he was a forgotten god. It was already good that the Dewatas, his creations, did not forget about him at all. Returning to the sanctuary, Mark was welcomed by the little girls. This time, there were 4 girls, though. It seemed that even Emika seemed really worried about Mark. There was also Aliyah, who did not mind the others, and intently checked Mark's body for injuries. It seemed that they were using the magical lake to watch the fight. The area where the battle happened was a bit outside the Dewata's territory. They could not watch it clearly. However, it was more than enough for them to see what was happening, especially that suicidal attack that Mark did to try and kill the enemy. While the youngest, Miracle, did not seem to mind it a lot, Abigail and Iola seemed to be showing displeasure at Mark's suicidal attack. It could not be helped. After all, their beloved father was injured by his recklessness. At the side, Jenny, Mark's aunt, watched the scene with a bitter smile. She was happy that her nephew seemed to have made a happy family. It was unlike hers, unfortunately. Looking around, the atmosphere in the sanctuary was not exactly good. While they won the battle, There were a lot of deaths due to the unexpected ability of Lord Cease. Still, it was way better than the expected outcome. After all, 300 warriors against thousands of demons would be considered suicide. In any case, they all died a glorious death. It was unlike the ones still alive, ashamed to show their faces to Dewata Araya. They were far worse than the supposedly weak Yasas. After Mark changed his clothes, he, once again, was seated at the seat he had the very first time he had been to this place. Unlike before, however, there were only a few people around the table. In Mark's group, there was only him, May, Amihan, and the little girls. Amika was not included, though. It seemed that she could not handle the presence of Fourth and joined the others that had the same circumstances as her. On Dewata Araya's side, there was Dewata Araya, Aliyah, and Morkle. Unexpectedly, Aliyah seemed to be more tolerant to Fourth's aura and managed to stay. And lastly, of course, Bathala and Fourth, the guests of honor. Dewata Araya had a lot of questions. After all, it was the first time that she heard about this second wave of the apocalypse. She could not help but pay attention to Mark, who seemed to be wary of it. It was too strange, after all. Not only that, but he actually had connections to both Bathala and Fourth. It made her reassess Mark, not just a demon, an ally, and Aliyah's grandson, but as someone who could possibly be above her in position. Normally, Fourth would not allow a third party to listen. She was here to address the sudden dimensional holes and speak to Mark. However, at Bathala's request, the Dewata was allowed to do so. Of course, Fourth would not answer the Dewata's questions, and Bathala would be the one to entertain her. Mark, on the other hand, had been in deep thought since receiving the initial information from Fourth. When he was informed about the second wave, he thought that the already existing mutagen would likely evolve drastically to affect Earth itself. However, he was mistaken. Who would have thought that the second wave would be caused by the arrival of a new variant of the pathogen that mutagen branched from? Although Mark had only known about 2 variants of that pathogen, while both had similarities, it was majorly different. Then, what kind of pathogen would it be? How would it affect the current pathogen on Earth? What effects would it bring to the whole planet? Unfortunately, to these important questions, Fourth had no answer. The Eye of Interest, 19th, had a book that would record everything and anything on Earth. However, it had one weakness. It could not record anything that was outside Earth until it entered the planet. It meant that the eyes had no information about the incoming disaster at all. What they were preparing for was the only possible impact of the planetary chunk that was currently traveling towards Earth. It was all for humans to not face the fate that dinosaurs saw millions of years ago. So, aside from the time of the crash and knowing that it's a chunk from an infected artificial planet, no other information? Mark grumbled. He was a bit distraught about it. After all, while they managed to do some preparations for the incoming dimension fusion, there was no way that they would be able to prepare for that incoming debris from space. At least, not in a very short time frame. Yes, unfortunately, Fourth replied with a shrug. We might be strong, but we are not omnipotent to know everything, especially from outside this planet. Fourth was not bothered by Mark's questioning tone. After all, she was long aware of this weakness of theirs. Mark fell silent, tapping his temple. He was racking things in his mind. Then, his eyes lit up. It seemed that racking up his mind worked. What about the aliens? Mark spoke. Those Greylings in America. Everyone turned at Mark in askance. Why were aliens suddenly brought into the topic here? Mark did not mind their confused eyes, and he stared at Fourth. 19th's book records everything that is inside Earth, right? It does, except for a few occasions. Fourth then glanced at Mark and May, like you too. Don't mind us. Mark shook his head. What I'm talking about is those Greylings in America. Since they are currently on Earth, they could be recorded, right? They should be. Fourth tilted her head, confused at what Mark was coming at. But what do those visitors had to do with this right now? A Greyling who calls himself Alpha Alston, Mark said, showing a bit of eagerness. That guy is researching about the mutagen on Earth. It is possible that he also had data and information about other infected planets. If he did, it should also be recorded in 19th's book, right? Hearing an unexpected loophole in 19th's ability, the eyes of Fourth lit up. If it was true that the Greyling called Alpha Alston had this information, they could also see it. Let me ask her, Fourth replied excitedly and was about to stand up from her seat. However, before Fourth was able to stand up, her shoulders were pressed down, making her unable to. There's no need to call me. Don't forget what you are, seriously. The calm but a bit exasperated voice of a teenage girl was heard. No one had noticed when she appeared, but they could see the door in space open behind her. So, you guys are watching, Mark said to the girl. Without a doubt, her calm demeanor that had no pressuring ripples, she was 19th. To Mark's words, 19th smiled. Anywhere where one of us is present, we are always watching. Another one. To the side, Bathala could not help but gulp his saliva. His demeanor as a god had long been overshadowed by Fourth. Now that 19th appeared, he did not bother hiding his fear of them anymore. He could not be blamed though. The eyes were responsible for the death of many gods in his time. Because of that, many misunderstandings rose, and many weaker gods like him thought that the eyes were discriminately killing the trespassing gods. Well, the misunderstanding was cleared now, though. Still, Bathala could not help but turn to Mark. This guy that had no clue about the eyes when they met before really became acquainted with the eyes. It was surreal. Furthermore, the eyes really seemed to value his existence. It was not only Bathala who was alarmed by the appearance of 19th. The others were the same. Barak, that was watching, not too far away, had already frozen stiff with the large characters suddenly appearing out of nowhere. Even Dewata Araya's group grew silent at the appearance of another godly existence. In any case, can you do it? Mark asked 19th. I don't think there is any rule that prevents you from doing that. Yes, there are no such rules. 19th shook her head. As long as they entered Earth as visitors, they should be under our jurisdiction. What I'm surprised about is for you to actually establish contact with one of them. Ah! Fourth suddenly exclaimed. Some time ago, a space vessel tried to approach your base. It seemed that they wanted to investigate it. I chased them away, though. Hearing what Fourth said, Mark could not help but frown. It seemed that his base had already gotten some attention from the extraterrestrials. It was good that Fourth chased them away. Then, you have my thanks. You did great, Mark said to Fourth without any pretense. After all, she did Mark a good favor this time. Unexpectedly, Fourth was frozen stiff. She then suddenly looked away, blushing. It's nothing. Everyone started at Fourth. Who was this adorable girl who was weak to compliments? To the side, 19th smiled. Fourth is quite a hard-headed and unruly one. It's hard for her to get complimented by anyone. That is why she's too weak to these kinds of things. You don't have to tell them that, Fourth complained out loud. However, 19th was still pressing on her shoulder and she could not move that much on her seat. This scene made everyone take the eyes in a new light. They might be exuding a godly aura around them. However, they were no different from living beings in terms of behavior. Mark understood this the most. The eyes were created by the emotions of humans on Earth. Because of this, it was not strange for them to exhibit human emotions. And to say, compared to humans, the eyes exude more emotions without schemes and pretense. Let's just leave Fourth at that. Mark spoke to 19th. I think it's better to see the information we needed immediately. Ahem. 19th coughed as she fixed her behavior. Pardon my unsightly behavior. Let me see. With those words, 19th conjured a book on her hands. Her two hands held the front and cover of the book as it flipped itself on its own. Unexpectedly, all the flipping took almost half a minute before it stopped. I'm sorry for the wait. 19th apologized. It took a bit of time since extraterrestrials were in the least of priorities we had, especially since we are looking about a specific information. It was not surprising. After all, these aliens were not from Earth. Their safety was the last in the priority of the eyes. Then, 19th let her book float from her hands to a space where everyone could see. And from the blank page of the enlarged book, letters began to appear. It was not Professor Alston's profile and information, however. Instead, it appeared to be some sort of document. This is. Mark could not help but stare at the document. Yes, what you have in mind is right. 19th nodded. This is the information about the incoming disaster. Day 152 to 1:42 a.m. Sanctuary, Katandwanas Mountains, Municipality of Bagamonok, Katandwanas. After 19th confirmed what the writings on her book were, everyone's attention became focused on it. It was information about the thing that was going to hit Earth soon. There was no way that anyone would not feel the urgency to know anything about it. However, the first few pages had unexpected information. Instead of the information about the planet the debris came from, it was a report of the first sighting of planetary debris. Wait a minute. Mark's eyes fell on the date of the documentation. They knew about it more than 2 months ago? That was right. The documentation dated about 2.5 months ago, and it seemed that even 4th and 19th were surprised by that fact. At the time that the eyes knew nothing about the second wave yet. However, by the looks of it, the aliens knew about the planetary debris. It was even before the inhabitants of Earth knew about it. Then, why did Professor Alston not tell Mark about this when they exchanged information with each other? At that thought, Mark shook his head. It was not that Professor Alston did not know. Mark never asked anything about something that he did not know would happen. That alien professor only answered Mark's questions, after all. Furthermore, it was not his duty to tell anyone about the incoming catastrophe. Mark continued reading further. The report continued with the order to investigate the spotted debris. Diwata Araya's eyes fell on some illegible words. What did that mean? 19th's book did not display a concrete document in a single language. In fact, to the reader, it showed a language that they could easily understand. In Mark's case, the book was written in English. However, in the eyes of Diwata Araya, it was written in the spirit language. Still, Mark was also focused on the same word. No, rather than a word, it looked like random symbols packed together. My apologies. 19th lowered her head. The document was written in a language barely known to anyone on Earth. While I managed to translate it into a language everyone could understand, some words had no equivalent translation in any language on Earth. Those symbols were the raw words from the document, then? Mark asked, and 19th nodded. Knowing this fact, Mark could only shrug. Even different languages on Earth had some words that were hard to translate into another language. It should not be surprising that there were untranslatable words on a document written in an alien language. Because of the translation error, everyone could only skip those words. It made Mark remember the time when he was reading badly translated manhwa. There was a whole lot of it, after all. When everything of those was gathered and counted together, it would make anyone think if the bad translations were done on purpose. It mostly happened on those Chinese comics, after all. The Japanese and Korean comics, manga and manhwa, barely had these issues after being translated. Back to reading the documents, Mark reached the part where the result of the investigation came in. Unexpectedly, the first result report was about casualties. As it appeared, the investigation team that Professor Alston sent actually had casualties upon investigating the debris. This made Mark frown. That planetary debris did not only carry a different pathogen, it was actually carrying infected in space. Furthermore, the infected were actually capable of destroying a few investigatory spaceships of the Greylings. This was bad news. Even so, Mark did not start to discuss that and continued to read instead. Finally, Mark reached the concluded information. It was the report of where the planetary debris came from and what pathogen it carried. Commercial Star. CS-11 Orbital Trade Station. It was an artificial planet intended to house an artificial race called Messinas. While it housed the artificial race, the station was also to serve as a space trading hub for space travelers and planetary merchants. Mark had shivers. It was actually sounded too much from a sci-fi story. However, he did not stop reading. The artificial planet was quite small. It had a radius of just a little bit more than 2,000 kilometers. It meant that it was just a bit larger than Earth's moon. However, 500 years ago, the CS-11 faced a catastrophe after its artificial atmosphere was breached by a large meteoroid. This information made Mark remember what happened to Earth during the start of the outbreak. As Mark expected, the meteor contained the pathogen that infected the inhabitants of the artificial planet. Since it was a trading station, it was not only its first inhabitants, the Messinas, were the ones infected. There were various races that became infected, causing the whole artificial planet to immediately fall into chaos. It took only a month and all life was wiped out in that small artificial planet. Being artificially made, however, the planet had its measures. At the time that all life was extinguished due to a pandemic, the artificial planet was designed to self-destruct. As such, it immediately exploded, trying to kill all the infected on its surface. It was unlike Arielis. The planet that freed came from exploded for unknown reasons, after all. Unfortunately, there were some miscalculations in the self-destruct sequence. One part of the planet did not explode into smithereens after the supposed explosion did not happen in that area. Because of the explosion from the other areas of the artificial planet, it caused that large part to get hurled into space intact. Many space organizations went to track that space debris. After all, it was a dangerous thing to be destroyed. However, it seemed to have entered a turbulent space area, causing everyone to lose sight of it. Now, the very same lost debris reappeared and was hurtling towards Earth, with the surviving infected specimens on its surface. Mark began to digest all this information as his eyes fell on the data about the Messinas, the inhabitants of CS-11. The Messinas were artificial intelligent creatures created by an ancient race of aliens called Divinas. These artificial creatures were specifically made to monitor the space stations created by the Divinas. Messinas were half organism, half machine creatures. Although they appeared to be humanoids with bodies made of muscle tissues, their bodies had mechanical parts that allowed them to have various functions that a regular organism could not do. This made Mark quite interested. In short, space androids, huh? Mark murmured. He was not wrong, but then, the worst part came. It was the nature of the infection that caused the destruction of CS-11. The Mutagen pathogen. It was a pathogen that would cause the infected to show aggressive tendencies towards uninfected and would try to infect them through bites. This was generic among these zombie-like pathogens. However, the abilities that the pathogen would give the infected made Mark frown deeply. Mutagen pathogen would turn the infected's muscle mass unstable, turning body parts of their victims into tissue-covered blobs. However, these blobs enabled the infected to integrate mechanical parts into the infected's bodies. Depending on the parts of the bodies of the infected that turned into blobs and the kind of mechanical part that the infected acquired, it would cause the infected to turn into various kinds. From the records, the most common were infected with mechanical arms or legs. However, there were a lot of accounts of stronger infected like a spider-type humanoid and even a mechanical golem type. Furthermore, due to the type of infection being unstable, there were a lot of shapes it could take on depending on the infected individual. At this point, Mark was rubbing his temple. It was a very troublesome kind of pathogen. Mutagen pathogen, huh? Mark was having a headache. It seemed that in the future, not only mutated infected would terrorize Earth. There would also be mechanical infected. In the worst case, the two pathogens might also fuse, giving birth to mutated mechanical infected. Surely, it was a headache. However, at the same time, Mark felt excited. It was something that could not be helped by someone like him. He was both an otaku and a zombie genre fan, after all. Mark was the first to read all of the information. Actually, it only took him a few minutes. While he was already at the end of the document, almost everyone else barely reached half of it. Because he was the first to finish, Mark had time to think about things while he patted Miracle, who was sitting on his lap. Aside from Iola, both Miracle and Abigail were not reading the document. It was too complicated to the young Abigail, and Miracle did not know how to read, after all. It was not surprising that Mark was the first to finish. He only needed to glance at the document, and it would be stored in his subconscious. He could review it any time he needed. At this point, Mark felt a gaze. It was from 19th. She did not need to read it at all since it was her book. "Thank you for your cooperation." Suddenly, 19th's voice echoed inside Mark's mind. "So, you can also do this, huh?" Mark replied inside his mind, making 19th nod slightly. "Even if I could access any information on Earth, it would be impossible for me to read every single one of them. Even for me, there is a lot about Earth to learn. Since you managed to point us to the correct information about the incoming disaster, you have my gratitude." "You guys didn't know about Professor Alston's research?" Mark asked. "No, unfortunately." 19th sounded apologetic. "We barely cared about the visitors as long as they did not cause any trouble. So far, Alpha Alston and his group are behaving fine to our standard. In fact, they were helping survivors in America to some extent. We can only be grateful to them for that fact." Hearing those words, Mark thought differently. Mark was sure that that grayling professor was not someone who would show good without anything in exchange. "I'm pretty sure that they were only doing that for benefits," Mark said in contempt. Even so, it did not change the fact that there were a lot of human survivors that were saved because of them. 19th replied. "It was not wrong, after all. Even if it was for benefits or a deal with the American government, they did save people. By the way." Mark closed his eyes and spoke in his mind. "From what Forth said, you guys can't do anything about that planetary debris? In terms of powers, you guys are stronger than the lost and forgotten gods. Yet, you guys needed their help for some reason. So, we can't hide it from you now." 19th bitterly smiled. "We are protectors and guides of Earth. We are created from the emotions of humans on Earth. We can only show our prowess and abilities inside Earth. Because of that, even an inch that we step outside Earth, we lose all our strength. Some of us might be able to create beams of energy to destroy and kill, but these beams can't extend outside the Earth's atmosphere and would instead dissipate. That is why the only thing we can do is to prevent our designated territories from sinking when the disaster struck." Those words from 19th were heavy. In a way, they were prisoners of Earth while being its protectors. "Are you pitying us?" 19th spoke in Mark's mind, sensing his thoughts. "You don't have to." With those few words, Mark understood what the girl in front of him wanted to say. It was the reason they exist. It was their duty. It was their fate. Furthermore, it might not be in the most ideal state. Earth, even in its peaceful days, were chaotic. There were a lot of people leading their lives astray. Now, everything was in chaos. Lives became cheap and many people had become evil. Even so, despite their grumbles and personalities, the eyes, they liked Earth, they loved Earth. And most and foremost, they will protect the humans inside it as much as they could. Day 152 to 4:21 a.m. Sanctuary, Katandwanas Mountains, Municipality of Bagamanok, Katandwanas. Hours passed by since the meeting started. The talk was long. Unfortunately, aside from the plans that the eyes had, no other plans were made. It was something that could not be helped. Dealing with gigantic extraterrestrial debris was not something within the scope of what Mark's group could do. The only thing everyone could focus on was the countermeasures in the aftermath of this disaster. Even if the lost gods managed to destroy the debris into smaller pieces and avoid a greater catastrophe, there was one thing that would happen for sure. It was the Mechad pathogen invading Earth. Furthermore, the pieces of the planetary debris would definitely cause destruction in every part of Earth. These pieces were not just some space rocks, after all. They were metallic pieces that could withstand the heat in the atmosphere and fall onto the land. The already declining population of humans would decrease further. There was no need to mention that the fusion of dimensions would also happen. Earthquakes would shake the entire planet as the dimensions fused. Human cities would collapse, creating ruins filled with trees and plants. The human-created settlements would get destroyed along with this event. Humans would lose their last safe havens in facing the mutated infected and the incoming biomechanical infected. In addition to the biomechanical infected, the magical infected would also start roaming the mortal world. With both kinds of infected appearing alongside the mutated infected, Earth would be thrown into further chaos, with most humans having nowhere to run to. The eyes would want to help humans with this. However, the rules the world had would not let them. The most they could do was warn the selected individuals about the incoming disaster. Unfortunately, everything would start in a week from yesterday. There was no time to idle. The most unfortunate part was that Mark's group did not manage to conclude plans. It was aside from strengthening the defenses of their base. It could not be helped as even the aliens with higher technological advancements did not manage to defeat the infected without causing the artificial planet to blow up. Furthermore, aside from thinking of plans and countermeasures, the rest of the meeting was spent trying to decipher the documents that 19th showed them. Aside from the general information about the Mutagen pathogen, there were actually documents of concrete studies about the pathogen. However, the documents were on the more scientific and extraterrestrial side. None of the people here could understand the translated scientific terminologies, and there were even a lot of untranslated symbols that filled the whole document. In the end, everyone could only give up on the specifics of the documents, although 19th promised to study the language as much as she could. It was the first time that an eye would learn a language that did not come from Earth. However, it was not out of curiosity but necessity. Even if 19th was the apostle of interest, she was never interested in things that did not come from Earth. However, looking at more documents that Professor Alston had, they found something horrifying. Aside from the Mutagen pathogen, he had documents about 200 more planets with different kinds of unique, infectious pathogens. About 150 of such planets were already declared destroyed. It was clearly a horrifying fact. However, Mark's eyes were actually focused on a specific name of a planet. Experimental planet, Arielis. Without a doubt, it was the planet that Freed and his group came from. Mark wanted to read about it. However, they had more urgent things to focus on. If Mark was to take even a glimpse of those documents, he would not be able to concentrate more on the incoming events. Thus, Mark decided to calm the urge to know and decided to leave it for later. Looks like it's already morning, 19th said, noticing the time. We had to go. So, the meeting ends here, Mark replied, making 19th nod. Because of you, we had more information about the incoming disaster. You have our gratitude. 19th slightly bowed to Mark. Are you two going to tell the other representatives about this? Mark asked. Unexpectedly, both 19th and 4th shook their heads to everyone's surprise. We already told everyone else about the incoming disaster about the heavens. 19th spoke. That would be enough. Even if we told things in detail, most of them would not understand it and forget. This made Mark confused. It was when 19th asked Mark a strange question. So far, how do you think we are telling the other representatives about the incoming disasters? Do you think that we are telling them in person? Wait. You don't? Mark was surprised about this. After all, Mark was personally told about this by the eyes. Usually, we enter their dreams and warn them. 19th explained. We use oracles as forms of warnings. You should know that most creatures on Earth could not withstand our presence even if we tried to hide it for the most part. Mark fell silent. It was a good reason. If they just appeared and talked to anyone about things, the person would probably fall unconscious before they could say anything. However, then what about me? Mark asked. So far, you guys personally brought the information to me. Not only you two, but even 9th also did the same. Mark remembered his first encounter with 9th. The boy told him about things personally and explained. It's true that he told you about the fusion of dimensions. 19th nodded, but remember, he only told you about vague things and never the specifics. In the first place, it is you who found him and made him show up. He did not intend to show up at all and would probably contact you in your dreams if you did not find him at all. Mark fell silent. Then, his eyes fell of 4th. This girl just appeared during their meeting, after all. Don't look at me. 4th harumphed. I didn't try to appear before you at first. I did try to enter your dreams the night before. But who would have thought that you're someone who had detached destiny? There is no way for me to enter your dreams at all. I had no other choice but to show up and bring the news personally. Even at the time that he met the other two eyes, it was him who found them first and made them come out of hiding. So, in the end, it was Mark's fault. In the first place, the eyes were existences not known to humans. They would try not to show themselves to unaffiliated people. In the first place, if they did show themselves to humans, the religious beliefs of humans would take a drastic turn, as humans might likely mistake them as gods instead of protectors. It was something that the eyes never wanted to happen. At this point, 19th smiled and added, "Do not think about it too much. Just treat yourself as someone special." Mark did not mind what 19th said, however, to everyone else present, it was a declaration. The eyes. The beings who were higher than the gods in myths and legends. They were giving Mark a special privilege. It was not a wrong thought. After all, 19th just told Mark that to others, they were giving oracle-like messages. These kinds of messages were vague, and it was kind of hard to accurately determine their meanings. It would be up to the recipient and the people to give their own meanings to these oracles. However, 4th and 19th gave them accurate information. Even 4th told Mark the exact day that the planetary debris would hit Earth, which was a week later. Aside from May, Amihan, and Bathala, the others were questioning in their minds as to why Mark seemed to be highly valued by the eyes. "What are you going to do next?" Mark asked 4th and 19th. "Search if there are still other foreign gods in hiding," 4th replied. "So far, we haven't had enough strength to completely obliterate that space debris. That is the most ideal outcome we intended to happen. Of course, it would not stop the Mechid pathogen from entering Earth," 19th added. "In the least, destroying that debris as much as possible will lessen the possible damage it could bring to Earth. If we could, we wanted to stop South America from sinking due to the absence of one of us. The only way to do that, however, was to completely destroy that debris. And to say, the eyes were completely lacking in that part. After all, the gods of the past were severely weakened in the present times." "Should I come too?" Bathala at the side asked the two eyes. "Not really," 4th nonchalantly replied. "I intend to bring you to where we are gathering the other foreign gods." "Then, can I just request to stay here for the time being?" Bathala asked. 4th tilted her head before turning to 19th. Thankfully, 19th nodded. Bathala is known for his compassion for his people and creations. Now that the world is in danger and his help is needed, he will not try to flee. 19th explained. Those words made the old man smile. "Then, I'll let you stay here." 4th finally agreed. "I'll pick you up when it's time." "Good." Bathala nodded. Then, the two eyes turned to Mark. "Then, we'll see you later." 4th and 19th then entered the door that popped out of nowhere before vanishing from their sight. As the two eyes disappeared, the scary pressure inside the sanctuary vanished. It made the spirits and elementals feel relieved. It was also the same for Barak and the other humans in Mark's group. Mark sat on his chair with a sigh. He was patting Abigail's head as she was sitting on his thighs all this time. The little girl had long fallen asleep though. Miracle was still awake. She was not human and did not really need sleep at all. Iola, on the other hand, was also awake but would not hold out for too long. Her eyes were already droopy. Children were not suitable for staying up for the whole night, after all. Aside from the little girls, Amihan was already asleep on top of Mark's head. "Do you have some place where they can sleep?" Mark asked Diwata Araya. The Diwata looked at Amihan, Abigail, and Iola. She then nodded and turned to Aliyah. "I'll guide you," Aliyah said to her grandchild with a smile. And there, Mark's group left the table, led by Aliyah. The other members of Mark's group also followed to finally take a good rest for today. At this point, it was only Diwata Araya, Morkal, and Bathala. They were all silent. "This is surprising." Diwata Araya broke the silence with an exasperated sigh. "What is surprising?" Bathala looked at the Dewata with a kind smile. Everything. Dewata Araya's shoulders drooped. It was not unexpected that things were hard to take in for Dewata Araya. Everything that happened after the battle would be shocking to anyone. Even now, it was hard to believe that Bathala was sitting before her at the same table. You don't have to be that surprised, my child. Bathala stared at Dewata Araya with amicable eyes. This happens for a reason. Just always keep an open mind. Bathala. Dewata Araya turned to the old man. Can I ask something? Just ask. You don't have to hesitate. Then, please pardon me. Dewata Araya straightened her shoulders. Bathala seemed to know Mark before. Just who is he? At this, Bathala smiled even more, seemingly expecting this question to come out of the Dewata's mouth. He is someone that could overturn anyone's destiny. Overturning one's destiny. Dewata Araya mulled. That is impossible, isn't it? Bathala suddenly said, knowing what was in the Dewata's mind. A person can only change his own destiny and affect others slightly. To overturn another's destiny. There's only one kind of people that could do it. And here, Dewata Araya came to a realization. Is he? No, Bathala shook his head. Not yet. But in the future, he could be. No, he will be. The next god born of this planet.